Continue on masculinity and femininity. It seemed that the rightful order of things, if is the masculine is in control of the feminine, and there were a lot of conduct books written during this time, and so it was the male voice controlling the female body. Back to the body analogy. So men, there was this underlying fear during Elizabethan age where there was this fear of maternal agency because maternity can be proven but paternity could not. So men depended on the female body. So if the female is out of control, then basically their parlineage, their lineage is doomed, and therefore society is doomed because the patriarchal society is dependent on women to produce the citizens to maintain that society. So there's always this fear of the feminine being out of control, the feminine being domineering and displacing the masculine. And also, like, there's almost like this inherent belief that the feminine is a destructive force. What else? And so there's always this anxiety of maintaining that the masculine maintain control over the feminine. And so that scene, that verse where Lady Macbeth describes dashing out the brains of her infant, it is indicative of that anxiety during that time. What else was it? Also, the proper gender and sexual roles, whatever. That sex is thought of in binary terms. So the masculine is the strong one, the lead. He works outside the home. The feminine, the wife, is submissive, quiet, passive, works inside the home. And so when we talk about the usurping wife, it's the feminine being the dominant, and that means the masculine has leaving Joanna, Lady Macbeth, and the demonology of hysteria. In her article, she talks about how the demonic woman or the witch is then transformed into the hysteric or the mother persona when the scientific revolution happens. And basically, it's like superstition led to like scientific ways in controlling the female body. The hysteric is when the female perform the patriarchal expectations of her, and then she suffers from it. So basically, like the demonic woman, aka the witch, and then the hysteric is basically like these ideas of the out of control woman, and both images reject the patriarchy, but they also reaffirm it because they are they're both being transgressive, going against what is expected of them, but then they also affirm that the patriarchy is needed to control out of control women. What else? And that, I guess, would in a way explain why in the beginning Lady Macbeth is more seen as the witch, but towards the end of the play, she becomes the sleepwalking hysteric. That basically the shift from the demonic woman to the hysteric, from the religious to the more rational. It's basically went from a religious like condition to like a medical condition. Like it's an ideology shift that that is just another explanation. Like it just shows still the misogyny and the anxiety during the time over the female body. It just shows how little is known about female sexuality and maternity. It was like that the witch trials didn't end because like people became rational. The witch trials stopped because there was a new means of having control over the female form. Let's return back to my previous discussion about Lady Macbeth, her guilt about killing King Duncan, conspiring and setting up to commit regicide, and her reluctance at that moment to kill Duncan when she was in his bed chambers. I found a source by Yael Greenberg, Lady Macbeth, and Rebecca West, The Masculine Woman's Oedipal Complex. And in that article, Greenberg discussed how the masculine woman, she feels guilt about killing her father, and so that guilt then leads them to commit suicide. So back to that passage where Lady Macbeth said she would have done it if Duncan didn't resemble her father.
Had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it.
In that moment, she associates Duncan with her father, and so when he is murdered, it's not a regicide, but I think it's called a parricide, killing the father. And so when Macbeth describes Duncan's corpse, she faints. People before thought of her fainting as like a way to escape suspicion from her and Macbeth, to come across like they were really distraught and grieving over his passing. But the fact, if you think of it as she now thinks of Duncan as her father and him dying, and the murder of him, she she becomes all grief stricken, and it just, and she faints. That her fainting may have been an actual real result of that moment and not an act, as I originally thought it was. Greenberg come to his conclusions based on what Sigmund Freud had said about, in his paper, some character types met with in psychoanalytic work. Freud discusses patients who collapse on attaining their goal due to forces of conscience, which forbid the person to gain the long hope for enjoyment from the fortune change in reality. So Freud focuses on two literary figures, Lady Macbeth and Rachel Rest, from a different play. I'm going to focus on Lady Macbeth. Killing of Duncan is where Lady Macbeth and Macbeth grow distant. They're isolated. They're not as close as they used to be, and so they both are being racked with guilt and in isolation. They're dealing with it by themselves instead of being what they once were, as Macbeth called Lady Macbeth his partner in greatness. So now they're no longer that, and the distance between them grows even greater when he continues to commit murderous acts without her. In Lady Macbeth's sleepwalking scene, she she reveals the crimes she commit in those sleepwalking scenes where she says her famous lines.
And then apparently Lady Macbeth lets out a really awful sigh because the doctor says, "What a sigh is there? The heart is sorely charged." Now the doctor hits on a possible cause of sleepwalking. Sorely charged means heavily burdened. Something extreme is weighing on her mind. Popular wisdom says it is because Lady Macbeth is guilty about the murder that the severity of her guilt results in extreme sleepwalking. And hey, that works, makes sense. However, my good friend Kimberly, who's currently reading the voice of Lady Macbeth, she has a different opinion. A while ago she mentioned this to me, and I waited to bring it up. She doesn't believe Lady Macbeth feels guilty at all. Now, at first I thought, what? That goes in the face of years of tradition and common wisdom. Lady Macbeth is riddled with guilt, which manifests as sleepwalking. It's always done that way, and that's what everybody thinks. And yet, as I looked at the text, I started to see her point. When you look at the lines, remove any acting interpretations and traditions, the words by themselves don't necessarily invoke guilt. They could be interpreted that way, but of themselves, they don't necessarily invoke that. They just repeat things that have already happened. Now, she never actually expresses guilt or sorrow as far as Duncan's death. Now, even the blood that won't wash off of her hands, she's scrubbing and scrubbing, trying to get them clean. Macbeth describes earlier that his hand will never be clean again, blood on the hands never coming off, and that has come to be a symbol of guilt. But does it actually represent feeling guilty as well? It's two different things, feeling guilty and being guilty. So Lady Macbeth's obsession with cleaning her hands in her sleep could just be an extension of her struggle to keep this terrible secret hidden. I mean, everything she's really saying in this is about hiding the murder, covering it up, hiding her guilt, her guilt in the crime not her guilty conscience.
The guilt of killing King Duncan drives Lady Macbeth and Macbeth to commit suicide. And what I mean by that is Macbeth he confronts his adversaries by fighting them in battle, and so he has a more tragic, heroic death, while Lady Macbeth commits suicide off stage, and she kind of, in her suicide, reaffirms the patriarchy and reaffirms like this, let's say, like, less than view of women. Her death clearly shows her guilt of the situation, and that may, like, it's almost like she didn't, I shouldn't stand by that, like, her death affirms that she's a weak character because she didn't face her adversaries the way Macbeth did, and so that's why he gets the heroic label while she is hated, basically.